Welcome to the fourth video in our module on the Bible, the greatest story ever told. Chapter 3, the Old Testament, Section 2, the Prophets. The Prophets. This section makes up the middle of the three divisions of the Old Testament for the Jews, but it is the last of the four divisions for Christians. Okay? For Jews, the prophets are divided into former and latter prophets. The former are Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. The latter prophets are Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and the 12 minor prophets. The 12 prophets were written on a single scroll and considered one book. Christians do not consider the former prophets to be prophets, but they call them historical books. Still, both Christians and Jews agree that the latter prophets are divided into two parts. We have the major prophets of Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel, and the 12 minor prophets. So as you see at the top there, the Jews call Joshua, Judges, and the books of Samuel and Kings the former prophets, but we call them the historical books. Which is why, actually, we have 4 sections of the Bible, and Jews have 3 sections, because what you're seeing here constitutes one section for the Jews, which is what we're looking at in this chapter, but it constitutes 2 sections in the thinking of Christians. This part of the scriptures was somewhat fluid up to the 2nd century BC and was finally fixed by a council of rabbis at Jebna or Jamnia in the year 100 AD. Hebrew prophecy. For the Hebrews, prophecy was not about foretelling or predicting the future. They saw prophecy as forthtelling or proclaiming, with only some predictive aspects. This means that a prophecy is something that needs to be said, but which most do not want to hear. In Hebrew prophecy, the phrase, "Thus says the Lord," is repeated constantly to emphasize the forthtelling theme. This is not meant to convey that the following statements were literally words of the Lord, but to give weight and authority to the prophet's forthtelling. All people have the ability to say what needs to be said, or to say that which is unpopular to hear, while others see it as their own spiritual giftedness. We call those often prophets. Historical books is what Christians call it, or the former prophets, what the Jews call them. We now look at them one by one. Joshua. Joshua is the main character here. He is the leader of Israel after the death of Moses. He helped to conquer Canaan and distribute its lands to the 12 tribes. Israel did not take Canaan by means of a single comprehensive calculated plan of conquest, according to most scholars today. It happened more gradually and more naturally through progressive infiltration and acculturation. This relatively peaceful development, which went on for a couple of centuries, reached its fulfillment in the rise of David. Until then, for the most part, walled cities remained in Canaanite hands. Israel does not seem to have made military use of any walled city except for David's occupation of Jerusalem. Therefore, it seemed that the Israelites kind of occupied the open spaces in between cities and did not do much with trying to overtake the walled cities or even cities that were built on mountains. What we see is more of forays by a mobile community moving ever westward that increasingly constituted a force to be reckoned within the open valleys between the walled cities. As Moses had before him, Joshua gave also a farewell address to his people, admonishing them to be loyal to the Lord of the covenant. In the closing chapters of Joshua, the Israelites reaffirmed their loyalty to Yahweh, or God. Judges. The judges to whom the title refers were charismatic leaders who delivered Israel from a succession of foreign dominations after their conquest of Canaan, which is now being called the Promised Land. This book covers the time between the conquest described in Joshua and the establishment of a kingdom under a king in the following books of Samuel. Here, judges were serving as temporary tribal leaders. The stories follow a single pattern. The people are unfaithful to Yahweh, who therefore delivers them into the hands of their enemies. Then the people repent and ask Yahweh for mercy, who then sends them another judge. The new judge delivers the Israelites from oppression, and then they prosper, but soon fall again into unfaithfulness, and the cycle is repeated. Before you is the list of the judges, as you see throughout the book of Judges. There are numerous parallels, First and Second Samuel. We'll take it as one book. The books of Samuel cover the period from Samuel, who was the last of the judges, through the reigns of the first two kings of Israel, which was King Saul and King David. The two books were originally just one. These books are called Samuel because he is the first main character in the story and was instrumental in the selections of the first two kings, but he disappears from the story early on. There are numerous parallels, repetitions, and discrepancies within the books of Samuel. Different accounts are given of the origin of the monarchy. There are 2 accounts of the rejection of Saul as king, and 2 more of David's instructions to Saul. Most scholars understand the books of Samuel now to be the product of many resources stitched together by one or several editors, one being the Deuteronomist. It is presumed that the Deuteronomistic historian collected these sources and joined them together in the production of his work. His various sources included conflicting accounts of the origin of the monarchy, meaning that some are pro-king and others are anti-king. Yet the historian intentionally held them in tension as a backdrop for the divine promise to the house of David, where both the permanence of the house of David as a ruling family and the condition that the morality of any king will bring Yahweh's punishment. These things, the permanence of the house of David and the condition that the people obey God, these are kept together in sort of a tension. 1st and 2nd Kings. The books of 1st and 2nd Kings continue the story of the nation of Israel from the death of David. Here we get the reign of Solomon and the divided monarchy through the collapse of both Israel, which was the northern kingdom, by the Assyrians in 721 BC, and Judah, the southern kingdom, collapsed by the Babylonians in 586 BC. The books of Kings are the last documents that belong to the group of historical books called the Deuteronomistic history, or the Deuteronomic history, written during the Babylonian exile around 550 BC. The author uses traditional materials freely to construct a unified presentation reflecting his personal views, interweaving materials from the north and south to emphasize the unity of the people, elaborating prophetic oracles with his own words, and at times offering his own reflections on the course of events. The books of Kings are thus very much the work of an individual. Again, we call this author the Deuteronomist. The Latter Prophets. Part 1 of the Latter Prophets is the major prophets. Isaiah. This book is one of the most profound theological and expressive works in the entire Bible. It was compiled over a period of about 200 years, from late 8th to late 6th century BC. The book is divided into 3 sections. 1st Isaiah, chapters 1 through 39, 2nd Isaiah, chapter 40 through 55, and 3rd Isaiah, chapter 56 through 66. 1st Isaiah contains the words and prophecies of Isaiah himself, an important 18th century BC prophet of Judah, written either by himself or by his contemporary followers in Jerusalem from 740 to 700 BC, along with some later additions. Isaiah is concerned about the nation of Judah for its many sins. The rich oppress the poor. The nation squanders economic resources on military spending. Idolatry runs rampant. Everyone tries to cheat his fellow men. Women flaunt their sexual charms, and there are many who cannot wait for a strong drink in the morning. Isaiah lived in Judah during the last years of the northern kingdom. As Israel was being threatened by the western expansion of Assyria, Isaiah began to be concerned about Judah's future too. Isaiah was convinced that only an unshakable trust in Yahweh, rather than in political or military alliances, could protect Judah and Jerusalem from the advances of their enemies. He called for recognition of the sovereignty of Yahweh and passionately denounced anything that worked against or obscured Yahweh's purposes, from social injustices to meaningless cultic observances. Second Isaiah, this portion contains a collection of oracles, songs, and discourses. It was written prior to and after the conquest of Babylon in 539 BC by the Persian king Cyrus II, Cyrus II the Great. The events in this section do not fall within the original Isaiah's timeline and therefore cannot be attributed to him. He could not have lived for 200 years. Third Isaiah, this section comes from a still later period after the return from the Babylonian exile in 538 BC, reflecting a Palestinian point of view, with the later chapters in particular addressed to the concerns of the restored community. The diversity of materials in these chapters suggest multiple authors. How the three Isaiahs came together is not known, though it probably assumed its present form during the 4th century BC. So therefore, the book of Isaiah is divided into 3 parts: a section from before the exile, a section during the exile, and a section after the exile. Much too long to be the work of one person. Jeremiah. The book of Jeremiah is a collection of oracles, biographical accounts, and narratives. It appears that Jeremiah began to prophesy in the 13th year of the reign of King Josiah, from 627 or 626 BC, and continued his ministry until after the siege and capture of Jerusalem by the Babylonians in 586 BC. Thus Jeremiah spanned 4 of the most tumultuous decades in his country's history. Many of his oracles concern the turbulent events of his time. Jeremiah's own prophetic oracles are found in chapters 1 through 36 and 46 through 52, while his secretary, Baruch, penned chapters 26 through 29 and 33 through 45. Jeremiah was a hesitant, reforming prophet, experiencing deep spiritual struggles regarding his adequacy from the very beginning of his call and throughout his prophetic ministry. His most important prophecy is about the new covenant, found in Jeremiah chapter 31 through 34. He prophesied about a time when Yahweh would make a covenant with Israel, superseding the old covenant made in the wilderness with Moses. Yahweh would write the law upon the hearts of the people rather than on stone tablets, and all would know God directly and receive his forgiveness. This new covenant lies behind the words at the Last Supper when Jesus says, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood." Ezekiel. The book of Ezekiel is about the prophet-priest Ezekiel, who lived both in Jerusalem prior to the Babylonian exile and in Babylon after the exile. He is part author of the book. This book exhibits a threefold theme. First is threats against Judah and Jerusalem, threats against foreign nations, and prophecies of restoration and hope. His early oracles in Jerusalem were pronouncements of violence and destruction. His later statements addressed the hopes of the Israelites exiled in Babylon. The faith of Ezekiel is the ultimate establishment of a new covenant between God and the people of Israel, has had profound influence on the post-exilic reconstruction and reorganization of Judaism. So in Ezekiel, we have this pattern of prophets. Here's what a prophet does. When things are going well, a prophet is going to have statements of doom and gloom. If you keep on like this, destruction's ahead. When things are bad, they issue words of hope. So right before the exile, right before Babylon came and took over their land, there was statements of doom and gloom, of warning, while the people in the land were just feeling good about themselves. Once they went into exile, many of them deported and their cities destroyed, families separated, that was when the prophet changed, or all prophets seem to do this, is to then hold out hope for restoration. When you are feeling good about yourself and there's peace and prosperity, the unpopular thing is to make statements of doom and gloom. When things are looking bad, sometimes the thing that people don't want to hear is words of hope, actually. Latter Prophets, Part 2, Minor Prophets, the 12. Listed before you are the 12 minor prophets. Hosea, a book of oracles composed and arranged by Hosea and his disciples. His contemporary was Amos. Both were great prophets of social justice. While both were still prophets of doom, they held out a hope to the people that the day of Yahweh contained not just retribution, but also the possibility of renewal. His message against Israel's spirit of harlotry was dramatically and symbolically acted out in his own personal life. Joel, a 3-chapter-long short book that relates nothing about Joel except his name. Joel lived during the period of the Second Temple of Jerusalem, that is after the exile, 516 BC to 70 AD was the Second Temple era. That wasn't his life. That was when they rebuilt the Temple of Jerusalem. Because his book reflects the liturgy used at that time. The book's central theme is a continuation of what prophets were saying before the exile, that salvation will come to Judah and Jerusalem only when the people turn to Yahweh. Then they will not only receive divine favor, but the land itself will become fertile. Amos. This is one of the most influential books of the Bible from the time it was written in the 8th century BC to the present day. Only 9 chapters long, it was composed during the age of Jeroboam II, king of Israel from 786 to 746 BC, making him the first of the writing prophets. Amos warned the Israelites against turning from Yahweh to the Canaanite gods, preached against the luxuries of the rich, and promised the eventual restoration of Israel. Obadiah. Only 21 verses long, nothing is known about the prophet as a person or about his times. Scholars are not sure if he lived before, during, or after the exile. The prophet concentrates on the judgment of God against Edom and other nations, with the final verses referring to the restoration of the Jews in their native land. Edom is a longtime enemy of Israel and is scolded for its refusal to help Israel repel foreigners who invaded and conquered Jerusalem. Jonah. This is a story about a reluctant prophet. This book contains no oracles and is thus very unique among prophetic books. Jonah is commissioned by Yahweh to go to Nineveh, the capital of the enemy Assyria, to preach repentance. In the end, his preaching was successful, which did not please him, for he felt that the Assyrians deserved God's wrath, not forgiveness. He learned, however, that God was a universal God and not the sole property of Israel. Jonah has traditionally been considered a sermon, meaning a work of fiction, not a historical book. Micah. Micah was an 8th century BC prophet. Micah is very similar to Amos. Micah attacks corruption and social injustice. Micah utters oracles against the corrupt religious and political leaders of Israel and Judah. He also attacks the prophets who attempted to give the people false hopes. Next, Israel's future is predicted as being glorious, and out of Bethlehem will come a ruler of the line of David who will bring peace to the earth. Though he issues an indictment against Judah for its idolatries, Micah proclaims what is necessary to renew the covenant relationship between God and Israel. Nahum. 3 chapters long, this book is directed against the mighty nation of Assyria, probably written between 626 to 612 BC, which was the date of the destruction of Nineveh, the Assyrian capital. The book celebrates and oracles hymns and laments the fact that Yahweh has saved Judah from potential devastation by the Assyrians. From there, he predicts the overthrow of Assyria and the devastating manner in which Nineveh will be destroyed. Habakkuk. Habakkuk is difficult to identify. He may have been a professional prophet of the temple from the 7th century BC. In 3 chapters, Habakkuk combined lamentation and oracle. He cries out for Yahweh to help his people. Though Yahweh will send mighty nations, Habakkuk wonders who will then stop these instruments of God's justice who use great force. The answer comes in a single verse. But the righteous will live by his faith. Habakkuk continues attacking those who commit social injustice and who engage in debauchery. His last chapter is a hymn anticipating the deliverance to be wrought by Yahweh. Zephaniah, another 3-chapter book. It is composed by the prophet Zephaniah in the latter part of the 7th century BC. It is an attack against corruption of worship in Judah, probably before the great Deuteronomic reform took place. Zephaniah attacked the religious syncretism that was being established. That is the blending of pagan and Jewish rituals that became established, especially the worship of Baal and astral deities, that is, deities of the sky, and predicted the coming catastrophic day of the Lord. He denounced both foreign nations and Judah, but issued a promise of the restoration of Israel. The reason for exaltation is that Yahweh will deliver his people. Haggai, a brief work in only 2 chapters, assumed to be the work of the prophet Haggai. This book consists of 4 prophecies delivered over a 4-month period in the 2nd year of the reign of the Persian king Darius I the Great, from around 521 BC. This book must be credited to someone other than the prophet. Haggai's oracles show his concern for the immediate reconstruction of the Temple of Jerusalem. He believed that the economic distress of the people was caused by their negligent delay in starting the construction, and that Zerubbabel, the governor of Judah under Darius, was God's chosen Davidic representative. Zechariah. This book dates from the same period as that of Haggai, about 520 BC. Only chapters 1 through 8 contain the prophecies of Zechariah. 9 through 14 must be attributed to at least 2 other unknown authors. Scholars thus refer to a 2nd and 3rd Zechariah. Deutero-Zechariah, or 2nd Zechariah, is chapters 9 through 11, and Tritio-Zechariah, that is 3rd Zechariah, is chapters 12 through 14. A contemporary of the prophet Haggai, Zechariah shared Haggai's concern that the temple of Jerusalem be rebuilt. Unlike Haggai, however, Zechariah thought that the rebuilding of the temple was the necessary prelude to the eschatological stage, that is, the arrival of which was imminent. That is to say that he was the one who was starting to believe that the Messiah was going to come, and God was going to bring about the completion of all that is. His 8 night visions depict the end of the age and the organization of life in the community after that time. Among Zechariah's visions was one that depicts 4 apocalyptic horsemen who foreshadowed God's revival of Jerusalem after its desolation during the Babylonian exile. Other visions announced the rebuilding of the temple and the world's recognition of Yahweh. And the last one is Malachi, written around 500 to 400 BC. The book consists of 6 distinct sections, each in the form of a Q&A discussion. The prophet defends the justice of God to a community that had begun to doubt that justice, begin to doubt God's justice because its end of the age expectations were still unfulfilled. The author calls for fidelity to Yahweh's covenant. He emphasizes the necessity of proper worship, condemns divorce, and announces that the day of judgment is imminent. Faithfulness to moral responsibilities and religious duties will be rewarded. Unfaithfulness will bring a curse. Malachi means my messenger, and he is believed to be a pseudonym for what is otherwise an anonymous author. So what you have here in all the prophets, again, especially with the 12 prophets, is that some of them lived before the exile, whether in the northern kingdom of Israel or the southern kingdom of Judah. Some lived during the exile. Some lived after the exile. The exile was the time of the prophets giving sometimes good news of what's to come, sometimes news of blessings and hope and peace, and other times news of pending destruction, depending on the current state of things. They look at the current state of things and they project in the future. If you keep doing this, this is what's going to happen. And of course, they're written as if they're always right, or most often right. Not all the prophecies have been fulfilled. Perhaps that means that people took the advice, and not all prophecies are to be fulfilled. We don't want all the prophecies to be fulfilled. They were meant to get people back on track. They were not prophecies to say this is what the future holds. This is what's going to happen in the future. They're not predicting the future as if it will happen. They're predicting the future so that people can change their lives now so that these things in the future don't have to happen. Okay?